Hello everybody and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode, and today's episode covers the Alaska class of large cruisers or battle cruisers, although I'll get to that topic probably a little bit later. First, what I'm going to do is sort of talk about how the ship came to be, and then while I'm doing that I will probably talk to you all about some of the specifics, and then of course I'll go over the Alaska class's relatively short operational history. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, cruiser construction the world over was pretty much controlled by the naval treaties signed at that time, the Washington Naval Treaty and then the London Naval Treaty. Cruisers mounted guns of the same size and were generally pretty comparable in terms of armor and performance. There was sort of one exception, that being the Deutschland class Panzerschiff, and that's because they had that interesting combination of sort of battleship guns with cruiser level armor. There was of course also rumors the Japanese were constructing a really lightly armored but heavily armed cruiser as well, which would basically be a counter to any sort of US heavy cruiser at the time. So the notion that these sort of ships existed forced the US Navy to start thinking about building a super cruiser of their own, something that would allow them to deal with any existing cruiser at the time. US Navy planners by the late 1930s were actually really worried about Japanese heavy cruisers. At the time, the only ships that could keep up with carriers in the screening role would actually be heavy cruisers, as the battleships in the US Navy were too slow. The worry was that the Japanese cruisers, and in particular this rumored supercruiser, would conduct independent operations against US Navy carrier groups and would actually overwhelm the 8-inch gun-equipped heavy cruisers of the US Navy. And thus, the idea of a supercruiser was a very attractive option, something that would be fast enough to keep up with the carriers and also fight against other cruisers if they come to cause any trouble. Of course, if you build a big enough ship like this, they are also going to be capable of independent operations, which was another very attractive proposition. And all of these factors led the US Navy to start looking into building this particular supercruiser idea, which eventually led up to the Alaska class. The design process was a bit convoluted. Many designs were proposed, all with their own supporters and opponents. Some initial designs in 1938 were ships armed with either 6 12-inch guns or 12 8-inch guns, with a large immunity zone against 8-inch shellfire. By April of 1938, the General Board decided that the 12-inch gun versions were the only really viable options, considering that other navies might go beyond the 8-inch gun, and that a ship armed with 12-inch guns stood a better chance against these potential changes. This led to designs of a ship around 26,000 tons armed with 9 12-inch guns, again with a large immunity zone against 8-inch shells. Both these designs in April of 1938 also had torpedo tubes, as there was this belief that in the sudden event that another cruiser popped up close, then there would be these torpedo tubes to deal with these ships that came really close. They were also incredibly fast ships, reaching 34 to 35 knots. While this design was accepted by the Secretary of the Navy, nothing seems to have come off of it, and no sketch designs of these ships are known to exist. After the start of World War II, the General Board would resubmit the 1938 large cruiser design, now designated CA-2, on the 18th of November 1939 as a potential candidate for construction to fulfill the needs of the US Navy for cruisers. This particular large cruiser had a large amount of supporters who wanted a ship that could counter cruisers like the German Panzerschiff, conduct independent operations, and at the same time provide fast carrier escorts. It was only rejected by the CNC, US Fleet and Fleet Training, who feared that building these large cruisers would reduce the resources that were being applied to US battleship program at the time. Another fear was, of course, that the advantage gained by building these large cruisers would very quickly be negated, as the enemy might go ahead and build battle cruisers armed with larger guns, say 14 to 16 inches. This actually had some validity, as after the war, plans for the Japanese B-65 project supercruisers were found. And while the first B-65 design packed 12.2-inch guns, the B-65B design packed 14-inch guns and were specifically designed to counter the Alaskas. So there is some validity to that fear. By the 22nd of November 1939, the CA-2 design was passed to CNR, but now with a revised change to the main speed of only 33 knots instead of 35. The 35 knot requirement was dropped because attempting to reach that speed required the ship to give up a lot of things. Underwater protection, there would have been armor that had to be given up to get that speed. So too many sacrifices were made, so the speed was dropped just a little bit. This was also because if you take away too much of the armor and the protection and things like that, then the ship would have been a lot more limited conducting independent operations, as they would have had very little survivability. The new 12-inch 50 caliber Mark 8 gun, however, was a very, very good gun that offered very good performance and could even be somewhat effective against enemy battleships. They fired a 1,140-pound armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second to a maximum range of 38,573 yards. Armor penetration at battle ranges of 15,000 yards was a very, very good 15.56 inches. Rate of fire was somewhere between 2.4 and 3 rounds a minute. Armor protection was mostly aimed at enemy heavy cruisers and panzer ships, with a thick enough belt armor to offer protection against close-range 8-inch cruiser guns. The thought being that when you're conducting independent operations, there's a pretty good chance that you might run into close-range gun duels against enemy heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns. So this initially was the reason why they wanted torpedoes, but it seems later on they just settled for a good immunity zone against those particular kinds of guns. So this would now lead to a massive series of designs and revisions. To simplify the issues, it mostly revolved around a sort of a balance between protection, the role these ships were meant to play, and then of course cost. So just to provide an example of these issues, and there was a lot of them, and so I can only really give you one example. The rest of them, you're definitely free to look those up, as there were many variations on this one design, and each of them tried to address one problem and giving up something else, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the one example. So for example, these ships were basically designed to have very limited underwater protection. So all the sort of battleship type anti-torpedo protection would not exist on these ships. This allowed these ships to save weight and hull volume, so that's good. But the designers looked at that and thought, well, these ships would be too vulnerable to underwater attack. So then they tried to incorporate some degree of protection against the 500-pound underwater explosive charge. But to do that, they sacrificed machinery space. The weight saved from the machinery space gave the ship some additional protection, but there was a reduction in speed to 30.5 knots. The problem with this reduction in speed now was that these ships stopped being able to really do the role that they were designed to do. See, these ships were meant to be cruiser killers, and that's why they need to go fast. But if you slowed them down to 30.5 knots, they sort of became small battleships, and they could no longer fulfill their role. And so that's not good either. So next thing you know, they were thinking, all right, maybe let's not do that, and let's sacrifice firepower. So let's maintain the machinery, but let's reduce it to only 7 guns. Well, then the fewer guns you have, the less likely you are to hit your target, and the less firepower you can put out. That's not really ideal either. And then, if you throw on other issues, like for example protection against airdrop bombs, which require better deck armor, or things like additional AA to serve as anti-air escorts, you can sort of see how everything is a sort of a competing claim to a certain amount of tonnage, a certain amount of space, and a certain amount of things. And the ship was really sort of that compromising. They were always trying to make those compromises to accomplish the goal that these ships were supposed to fulfill. Alright, so let's go back to what ended up happening, right? So 6 whole months later, where everybody at the top echelons of the fleet were arguing over things, and they were looking at all these designs, they sort of came over and recognized that the best design was a CA-2B design, which was 800 feet long, a 32,550-ton ship, 9 12-inch guns, good protection against 8-inch guns, even decent protection against 12-inch guns, and a 33.5 knot top speed. But these ships would be way too costly, as they were really starting to approach the cost and the resource of a battleship. So that was just too much. So finally, on the 16th of July 1940, the General Board picked the CA-2G design as the one that offers the best compromises. The original design of the CA-2G was a 790-foot long ship, 27,500 tons, 8 12-inch guns, 2 triple turrets and 1 double turret, 12 5-inch 38, armor protection sufficient for 8-inch shell, immunity zones from 9,500 to 27,000 yards, and protection against 12-inch shells from 18 to 23,000 yards. Speed would be 33 knots on 150,000 shaft horsepower. 6 ships of this design were authorized under the Fleet Expansion Act of the 19th of July 1940 and ordered from the New York Shipbuilding Corporation on September 9, 1940. The ships were named after U.S. territories to show their position between sort of battleships named after states and cruisers which were named after cities. However, the CA-2G design would go through some further changes. It would take almost until July of 1941, so that's almost another whole year later before the design was finalized. The armor of the original CA-2G design would be reduced a bit, with the belt armor becoming thinner from 10.1 to 9 inches, and they would be made a little bit more uniform, and the armor would raise a deck higher than in normal cruisers, so armor protection was going to be okay, although not as good as the original design that they picked. Additional protection was then added to the deck armor, making it between 3.8 to about 4 inches, making the ship a little bit more resistant to deck hits. Another major change was the replacement of the double 12-inch gun turret with another triple, and so giving the ships the final configuration of 9 12-inch guns. This change was actually initially rejected, but after the armor changes, there was additional weight that could be used for further improvements, and the turret change was accepted. The turrets themselves were actually quite interesting. They actually had a decent amount of side armor, and this was a little bit different than things before, because most ships before just had very, very good turret face armor and not so great side armor. But on the Alaskas, they actually had very respectable side armor, and this is because of the experience of the Graf Spee, because a bunch of smaller cruisers were able to essentially overwhelm and engage from multiple directions. And so the designers of the Alaska realized that there's a chance that this ship might be overwhelmed by a couple of smaller cruisers, and thus needed to be able to point guns at different ships in different directions and engage those. This would of course lead to the potential that other shells hitting the turrets on the side would disable turrets that weren't aimed in that direction, and so therefore they needed better side armor. And this resulted in the Alaska having significantly better side armor than other ships. So they had 12.8 inches of turret face armor, 5 inches of roof armor, 6 inches of forward side armor, and 5.25 inches of after side armor, which originally was only 4 inches, so this was definitely an improvement, and also 5.25 inches of rear armor. The Alaskas also only had a single rudder, a characteristic of cruisers, but it made these sort of large ships rather sluggish. All in all, the Alaska took certain cruiser features and certain battleship features and put them together into one hull. They had very, very limited underwater protection, but their protection against shells was vastly superior to that of a heavy cruiser. In fact, I'm just going to show you a little picture here, and you'll see that on the left is the Alaska's armor profile, and on the right is the Iowa's profile. And you can see how the Alaska's armor profile is very, very simple. There's not a lot of underwater protection, but on the other side, look at the Iowa, and you see below the waterline, you'll see a lot of different bulkheads and compartments and things like that designed into a very intricate anti-torpedo protection system, while the Alaska had pretty much nothing. Then, of course, you have wartime experience and the realization that aircraft would now play a major role in naval warfare. And of course, the Alaska's AA armament was drastically increased because of that. Thankfully, the increase in weight from all the additional AA guns didn't really lead to any stability issues for these large ships. By the end of the war, the Alaskas had a total of 12 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, 56 40mm guns, and 34 20mm guns. On trials, the Alaska was a little bit underwhelming performance-wise. She made 32.72 knots on 173,800 shaft horsepower, below the design speed of 33 knots. Range was also a little bit lower, 11,350 nautical miles at 15 knots, as opposed to the design figure of 12,000 nautical miles. Turning radius was actually better, significantly better than estimates though, only 800 yards instead of the predicted 1,060 yards. So let's go back to the earlier question. large cruiser or battle cruiser? I actually think the Alaskas are actually battle cruisers instead of being simply large cruisers. The traits of a battle cruiser consisted of high speed at the expense of armor and battleship armament. In both cases, the Alaskas fit this description. They were designed for high speed in order to engage enemy cruisers and to avoid confrontation with battleships. The amount of armor the Alaskas had seemed to reflect this idea of battle cruisers, fighting enemy cruisers, and then if they ran into battleships, they would just have to run away with their superior speed. The armor protection that the Alaskas had offered pretty comprehensive protection against 8-inch shell fire, and somewhat limited protection against 12-inch shells. Anything bigger, and the Alaskas weren't protected at all, essentially. The 12-inch 50 caliber guns on the Alaskas would have overwhelmed any treaty-heavy cruiser, but maybe not so much larger battleships. I would strongly argue that these ships were indeed battle cruisers, so why was the US Navy so insistent on designating them large cruisers or just cruisers in general? And I think a large part of this is political. Reading through the design history of the Alaska, one gets that feeling that the ships were called battle cruisers, or had the ships been called battle cruisers, then they would have diverted resources meant for battleships, and the battleship program would have then suffered. Calling them cruisers would have been easier to get them approved with no loss of resources for the battleship projects, which were very, very important. This whole designating ships of a smaller class in order to get them approved and funded and built is not exactly an uncommon thing that was done. Considering even today, governments or politicians will still do that in order to get certain things done. Take, for example, the Royal Netherlands Navy. They have a class of 6,000-ton frigates, which they've designated frigates, but if you look closely, they rival the capabilities of many destroyers in other navies. But they were primarily called frigates for political reasons in order to get them approved and built. So I think that's really why there was this emphasis on calling these Alaskas large cruisers and trying to emphasize the cruiser aspect rather than just calling them battle cruisers, which would bring up ideas of capital ships and would probably then have negatively impacted the US battleship program. Alright, so we've looked at all the design and stuff. Let's talk over the really short service history of these two ships. The Alaska and Guam were the only two ships of the Alaska class that were completed. Hawaii, the third one, was never completed, although she had some pretty interesting concepts for converting her, such as turning her into like a command ship. That was not done, or maybe turning her into a guided missile cruiser. That really wasn't done either. There had a lot of these really cool ideas for the ship, but nothing was done. She was eventually scrapped as well. Alaska and Guam, however, were actually completed and actually served during World War II, but they had very short service careers. The Alaska and Guam started taking part in active operations in 1945. The Alaska was ahead of the Guam by about 3 months. So in February of 1945, the Alaska served as the escort for the carrier's Enterprise in Saratoga when they were conducting air raids against Tokyo. She was then transferred and supported the assault on Iwo Jima as part of Task Group 58.4, and she stayed with the same task group during the Battle of Okinawa. During the battle for Okinawa, the Alaska screened the carriers Yorktown and Intrepid, and her first shots in anger occurred March the 18th when the Japanese launched a pretty major airstrike against the carriers. Her gunner shot down a Yokosuka P-1Y Francis bomber, which was attempting to crash into the Intrepid. A little bit later, though, she shot down a friendly F-6F Hellcat, but luckily the pilot survived by ditching the aircraft. At around 1:15 later that afternoon, the Alaska shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber. On the 19th, the Japanese attacked again, and this time was able to badly damage the carrier USS Franklin. The Alaska and Guam escorted the damaged carrier back to safety, and along the way, the Alaska used her radar to help direct fighters to intercept and destroy a Kawasaki Ki-45 fighter. On the 27th of March, the Alaska and Guam bombarded the island of Minami Daito. The Alaska fired 45 12-inch shells and 352 5-inch rounds at the island. They returned to Okinawa on April the 1st to assist with the Okinawa landings. For the month of April, both the Alaska and Guam continued to provide heavy anti-aircraft fire and driving off Japanese air attacks. Both the Alaska and Guam returned to Olathe for maintenance and replenishment in May of 1945. Both ships were then assigned to Task Group 38.4 of Halsey's Third Fleet and returned to Okinawa to continue serving as carrier escorts. Both ships bombarded Okinawa on June the 9th, after which they both steamed for San Pedro Bay in the Leyte Gulf. Both ships were then assigned to Cruiser Task Force 95 and conducted sweeps in the East China and Yellow Seas to sink Japanese shipping. This was, of course, of limited success because pretty much by then the majority of Japanese shipping was already underwater. Both ships again participated in a raid into the estuary of the Yangtze River off Shanghai, again meeting limited success. Both ships returned to Okinawa by August the 7th, and not too long after that, the war ended. After the war, the Alaska and Guam both participated in bringing soldiers back to the United States from Asia. Both the Alaska and Guam were formally decommissioned on February the 17th of 1947, ending their really short careers. The Alaska having only been in service for 32 months, while Guam was only in service for 29 months. They were both stricken in 1960 and sold for scrap. And that, folks, is the story of the Alaska-class battlecruisers. I really hope you enjoyed this Know Your Ship episode. I also want to take this time to really thank my patrons who support me on Patreon and allow me to spend time on making these episodes. If you like what I'm doing, do not forget to like and sub. Anyways, folks, take care, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you again really soon.